Markets do many things very well, but are there cases where markets fail? Until this point, we've talked about private goods, goods that are rival. I can keep you from using mine. We found markets do well with private goods. But do markets for goods with externalities function efficiently? That's the question we'll ask in this video. An externality arises when a person engages in an activity that influences the well-being of a bystander, but doesn't pay or receive compensation for their effort. If I burn gasoline or dump industrial waste in a river, I'm negatively influencing the well-being of bystanders without compensating those who are affected. If I get vaccinated or plant trees in my front yard, I'm positively influencing the well-being of bystanders, again, without being compensated. So in this video, let's consider the market for a good with a negative externality. Gasoline generates carbon dioxide as a byproduct, which carries with it a negative cost imposed on society, which isn't included in the costs. To model the market for gasoline, let's first start by ignoring the externality. The demand curve represents the willingness to pay, or marginal private benefit, for gasoline at a range of prices. We've used demand in past videos, but from here on out we're going to use marginal private benefit, their equivalent. The supply curve represents the willingness to supply gasoline at a range of prices, which we'll rename as the marginal private costs. Both the marginal private benefit and the marginal private cost capture private costs and benefits, as you might suspect from the names. These are the components of the good that are private. And as we've done repeatedly, we can find the equilibrium price and quantity, ignoring externalities, by intersecting the private supply and private demand curves. This is what we'll call the private equilibrium. In the presence of this negative externality, though, looking only at the private supply and private demand curves ignores the externalized costs. Here is where we go back to the social planner, who's concerned with maximizing the welfare of society. The social planner doesn't want to ignore externalities, so instead decides to include them in the model by adding them to the marginal private cost curve, which gives us what we call the marginal social cost curve. Adding costs, as we've done before, shifts the supply curve up. So once we've added the externalized costs to the cost curve, the marginal social cost will be higher than the marginal private costs. Then the social planner asks, once we've included all the costs to society, how should I set quantity? Like our discussion on efficiency, the social planner maximizes welfare when the cost of the last unit, as represented by the marginal cost curve, and the benefit of the last unit, as represented by the marginal benefit curve, are equal. Here, since the social planner needs to include the social costs, the cost of the externality, we find the quantity that makes the social cost of the last unit equal to the benefit of the last unit. As always, we find this quantity by intersecting the two relevant supply and demand curves. Here, the difference is that since we're including the externality, we need to use the social cost curve. By intersecting the marginal social cost curve with the marginal social benefit curve, or in this case, the marginal private benefit curve, since we have no positive externalities, we find the quantity that maximizes welfare. And here we can see that this optimal quantity is smaller than the market equilibrium quantity. This probably works with your intuition with comparative statics, that quantity goes down when costs go up. We're going to come back to think about prices, but for now let's just leave prices as they are and think about welfare. Welfare with externalities works very similarly to what we've been doing. In past work, we haven't needed to differentiate between the social and private curves. We've just used the supply and demand curves to find welfare. Here, since we also have a value to society external to the private curves, we need to use the curves with the externalities included. If you want to integrate this idea with past concepts, you can think of the supply and demand curves from our past work as being the social curves, just with no externalities. In this way, private consumer surplus, or just consumer surplus, is the area under the marginal private benefit curve, above the price and inside the quantity. And you'll notice here that the marginal private benefit curve is also the marginal social benefit curve, since we have no positive externalities. Private producer surplus, or just producer surplus, is the area above the marginal private cost curve, below price and inside quantity. The externality is the area between the marginal social cost and marginal private cost, inside quantity. Here, since the externality is constant, and will be constant in this type of model in this class, we can just multiply the externality by the quantity. Total surplus is equal to total private surplus plus or minus the externality, depending on whether it's positive or negative. And for deadweight loss, think about adding one more unit of quantity. If we add one more unit, we're adding social marginal benefit, because one more unit carries with it some benefit. And we're adding social marginal cost, since the unit also carries a cost. It's always better to add one more unit when the benefit exceeds the cost, and it's always better to remove one more unit when the cost exceeds the benefits. We can find the marginal social benefit by intersecting the quantity we're interested in with the marginal social benefit curve. The same with marginal social costs. So if the marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal social cost for a unit, adding that unit increases our welfare. And if the marginal social benefit is less than the marginal social cost, adding that unit decreases social welfare. For any one unit, the unit carries a deadweight loss if the benefit is greater than the cost and not exchanged, or the cost is greater than the benefit and exchanged. So deadweight loss is the area represented either by this missing benefit or by the added burden. In all our previous economics, we looked only at deadweight loss from lost surplus, where the benefit was greater than the cost, but not exchanged. Here we have the other side, where cost is greater than benefit, but we exchange it anyway. So here we find the deadweight loss in our model by looking at where the marginal social cost is greater than the marginal social benefits, above the difference between the social equilibrium quantity and the private equilibrium quantity. This difference is what we'll call suboptimal quantity. In the past, we've called this lost quantity, since we've only looked at deadweight loss due to quantity exchanged being less than the efficient quantity. Here we're extending that previous notion to include cases where quantity is too large. A positive externality can be thought of in a similar way. Flu shots, or after it's developed, a COVID vaccine, carries a positive externality. Because I have a flu shot, you, the bystander, are less likely to get the flu. So the marginal social benefit is greater than the marginal private benefit. And here, the social equilibrium quantity is higher than the private equilibrium quantity. If this type of modeling reminds you of taxes, you're on the right track. In the next video, we'll think about how to set prices properly in markets with externalities, which involves taxes and subsidies.